forest was silent, not the gentle hush of snowfall, not the quiet of a sleeping wilderness. No, this silence was wrong. It was heavy, deliberate, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. It was February 1987. Deep in the boreal woods of northern Ontario, a small hunting cabin sat alone. 4 men huddled inside, lanterns low, rifles ready. They were seasoned outdoorsmen, hardened to the cold. But on this night, something stalked the perimeter of their cabin. At first, it was just the crunch of footsteps in the snow. Then came the voice, a human voice, calling one of their names. But there was no one else for 30 miles. When they finally looked outside, they saw a figure, tall, starved, antlers twisting from its skull, eyes glowing red in the dark. And then Edward realized. The voice wasn't coming from outside the cabin. It was inside. The fire sputtered. The stench of rot filled the air, and 4 men were left staring into shadows that seemed to stretch and breathe on their own. But what happened next, no one could explain. Before we continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark myths, strange histories, and forgotten legends are worth remembering, if you believe the mysteries of our past should not be lost, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we open the frozen trail into a wilderness older than memory. We will trace the legend of the Wendigo from Algonquin fireside warnings to colonial accounts of madness and murder to chilling encounters whispered even today. This is not only the story of a monster, it is the story of hunger, of greed, of the terrible things that live inside us when the world turns cold. To understand the Wendigo, we must first step into its world. The endless forests, the starving winters, the silence that waits at the edge of every firelight. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand what happened in that cabin, we have to go back, long before Edward, long before 1987, back to the first people who lived in the vast northern forests. Among the Algonquin-speaking nations, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Innu, the Mi'kmaq, there was a name spoken in hushed tones, Wendigo. The stories were never told lightly. They were warnings. Winters in the boreal north were merciless. By February, food was scarce, sometimes gone altogether. Families huddled in lodges, firelight flickering on bark walls, listening to the wind outside claw at the trees. And in those nights of hunger, they told the story of the Wendigo. The Wendigo was not born a monster. It had once been human, a hunter, a mother, a child. But when starvation pressed too close, when the body trembled with weakness and death felt inevitable, one person chose the forbidden path. They looked at their people not as family, but as meat. The first bite changed everything. That act of cannibalism twisted the soul, and the eater was transformed. No longer human, no longer capable of satisfaction. The Wendigo rose up, gaunt and skeletal, its lips chewed away, its eyes glowing like coals. 15 feet tall, some said. A heart frozen solid inside its chest. But the most terrifying thing was not what it looked like. It was what it meant. The Wendigo was endless hunger, To see one was to be reminded of the temptation hiding in every starving winter. And if someone began to crave human flesh, if they grew restless, greedy, strange, then the village whispered. Perhaps the spirit had already taken hold. Perhaps they were becoming Wendigo themselves. The French missionaries who came into the forests in the 1600s wrote of these stories. They described the dread in their guides' voices, the sudden disappearances during hunting trips, the people who claimed they were pursued by voices in the snow. The Jesuits even wrote of executions. A man accused of Wendigo possession might be killed not out of hatred, but out of fear. Communities believed it was the only way to save themselves. Outsiders dismissed it as myth. But those who lived in the forests knew better. For them, the Wendigo was not just a monster. It was a warning etched into survival itself. But sometimes, the line between story and reality blurred. In 1878, a Cree man named Swift Runner lived with his family in Alberta. He was strong, respected, a capable hunter. But that winter, he returned from the woods alone. When investigators reached his cabin, what they found was unthinkable. Bones, cracked open for marrow. Human remains strewn in the snow. Swift Runner confessed. He said the Wendigo spirit had entered him, had driven him to slaughter and consume his wife, his children, his mother-in-law. But what horrified the community most was not the crime itself. It was that Swift Runner had been within walking distance of a Hudson's Bay Company outpost. Food and supplies had been available. They could have survived, and yet he had chosen otherwise. Swift Runner was hanged at Fort Saskatchewan, the first legal execution in Western Canada. His story became proof in the minds of many that the Wendigo was real. For centuries, these stories lingered. Some scholars came to call it Wendigo psychosis, a cultural sickness that emerged in times of famine, when belief and desperation fused into madness. Victims claimed they were turning into monsters. Some begged to be killed before they could hurt their families. To outsiders, this was pathology. To the people of the North, it was confirmation. The curse still roamed. And into this landscape, much later, came Edward. Edward was a seasoned trapper, 42 years old. He knew the woods as well as anyone could. His life had been one of hard winters and rough work, but he respected the wilderness. He believed the forest had rules, and that if you honored them, you would be safe. With him, that winter were three others. Daniel, his brother-in-law, just 28, lean and restless, always quick with a joke. Michael, Daniel's childhood friend, a little younger, tagging along for the adventure. And Victor, a Cree hunting guide Edward had hired for the trip. Victor was older than Daniel and Michael, but younger than Edward. He was quiet, sharp-eyed, and he carried with him a knowledge of the woods that came from stories passed down through generations. They had built their cabin in a clearing 30 miles off the nearest marked trail. Edward thought it was the perfect spot, but Victor had warned against it. He stood in the snow that first evening, gazing at the tree line. "This place," he said, "is too still." The others laughed. A quiet forest meant good hunting, didn't it? But Victor shook his head. Sometimes, quiet means something else. The others ignored him. They stacked firewood, set their traps, and tried to forget the unease in their guide's voice. Edward believed in the rules of the woods. Don't take more than you need. Don't leave food uncovered. Don't mock what you don't understand. But that winter, one by one, those rules began to break. At first, it was small. The traps came up empty, though tracks in the snow showed animals had passed. A rabbit snare snapped, the line shredded, as if something had bitten clean through it. Then came the stillness. Days went by without hearing a single bird, without seeing so much as a squirrel. Even the wind seemed to move around the clearing instead of through it. And then, one night, the smell arrived. At first, faint, like meat left too long in the sun. By morning, gone. The men blamed it on their supplies, but when they checked, nothing was spoiled. Then the smell returned the following night, stronger. Rot, metallic and choking, drifting through the cabin walls. Victor was the first to speak the word, quietly under his breath. Wendigo. Edward didn't like the way it sounded. He told Victor not to bring superstition into the camp. But Victor only looked at him with tired eyes and said, "You'll see." The nights grew longer. Firewood burned faster, the silence pressed harder, and then came the footsteps, slow, heavy, circling the cabin. The men stayed inside, gripping their rifles, lanterns shaking in their hands. Through the window, Edward caught only glimpses, a shadow crossing between trees. Something tall, something gaunt. The next morning, they found tracks, not animal prints, not human either. They were long, stretched, and set deep into the snow, as though something impossibly heavy had passed through. Daniel tried to joke, said maybe it was a moose walking funny, but his voice cracked when he said it. Michael refused to go outside after dark. He swore he heard a voice in the woods calling his name, a voice that sounded almost human, but not quite. And Victor, he said nothing at all. He only sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. What Edward and his companions didn't know was that they were stepping into a story far older than themselves. The same story told in lodges centuries before. The same warning whispered by Jesuit priests in their journals. The same madness that had driven Swift Runner to the gallows. The Wendigo does not need famine to appear. Sometimes it only needs silence. Sometimes it only needs you to listen. And in that cabin, in the winter of 1987, Edward and the others were listening. They had no choice. The first night Edward heard the voice, he convinced himself it was a trick. Snow plays with sound. The forest echoes in strange ways. He told himself it was just his mind, caught between sleep and waking, but the others heard it too. "Edward!" The voice stretched through the dark, thin and uneven, like it was being pulled from a throat, not built to form words. The men sat in silence, staring into the shadows pressed against the cabin walls. Then, nothing. Only the fire crackling. Only their own breathing. When morning came, they told themselves it hadn't happened. The woods do things to you when you're this far out. Isolation makes every sound bigger, every silence deeper. They laughed it off over coffee boiled on the stove. Daniel said he must have been sleep-talking. Michael tried to laugh with him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. Victor didn't laugh at all. That day, Edward insisted on checking the trap lines. They needed meat, and he refused to let fear undo them. So the four men bundled up, rifles slung, boots crunching through deep snow. The air was sharp enough to cut your lungs. The forest was still, so still it felt like walking through glass. At the first trapline, they found nothing. Not a rabbit, not even disturbed snow. At the second, the snare was snapped clean, the wire twisted like soft clay. Then Michael froze. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the ground. There, in the snow, were prints. They were long, narrow, almost human, but each one was twice the size of Edward's boot, and deeper, far deeper, pressed down as though whatever had walked here was impossibly heavy. The prints stretched in a line into the trees, and then suddenly stopped, as if the creature had vanished into the air. Daniel forced a laugh. Snowdrift must have covered the rest, but his voice carried no conviction. The men turned back to the cabin before finishing the line. None of them said what they were all thinking. The traps hadn't just been empty. Something else had been here, something watching them. That night, the voice came back, not once, but over and over. Sometimes it called Edward, sometimes Daniel, sometimes even Victor. But the worst was when it called Michael, because when it spoke his name, it sounded almost like his mother's voice. "Michel." He pressed his hands over his ears, rocking on his cot, muttering that it wasn't real, but it didn't stop. Each time, it sounded closer, clearer. Edward raised his rifle, pointing it at the door, at the window, at the corners of the room where the shadows bent unnaturally. The fire burned low, the lanterns flickered, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. But the silence it left behind was worse. By the third night, the smell had become unbearable. It seeped through the cabin walls, thick, rotten, metallic. It coated their throats, made their eyes water. Edward checked their supplies again. Nothing spoiled, nothing wrong. But the smell grew stronger until Victor finally whispered, "It's close." No one slept that night. At dawn, Daniel cracked open the door. The clearing was empty, no tracks, no movement, only snow glittering in pale light. But the smell lingered, stronger than ever. And when Edward stepped outside, rifle in hand, he realized the truth. The stench wasn't coming from the woods. It was coming from beneath the cabin. The cabin had been built quickly, on skids of timber laid over snow-packed ground. Now, crouched in the freezing air, Edward lifted one of the skids and peered into the darkness beneath. At first, nothing, just hard earth and frost. Then, his lantern caught something pale, a bone, long, split clean down the middle. Not animal, human. Edward staggered back, heart pounding. "This isn't ours," he whispered. Victor's face tightened. This place was already claimed. The others stared at him, wide-eyed. "Claimed by what?" Michael demanded. Victor looked to the tree line. His lips moved soundlessly at first, then finally, "Wendigo." That night, the scraping began. From beneath the cabin came the sound of something dragging, slow and deliberate, like claws raking against frozen earth. The men sat in silence, rifles clutched to their chests, staring at the floorboards as dust trembled loose between the planks. Then came the knock, once, twice, 3 times. From directly beneath Edward's bed, he leapt to his feet, cocking his rifle, shouting into the floor, "Get the hell out of here!" The sound stopped. The silence returned, but the smell stayed. And none of them slept. On the 5th day, the cabin door rattled. Edward grabbed his rifle and motioned for the others to be silent. The door shook again, then a voice, human, desperate. "Please, let me in." The men exchanged glances. Edward cautiously opened the door. Outside stood a man, thin as a shadow, his clothes torn, his skin grey with frostbite. His lips were gone, teeth bared in a rictus grin. "Food," the man croaked. "Please, food." They pulled him inside, sat him by the fire, handed him a cup of water. He drank greedily, choking, spilling half of it down his chin. But then Victor saw his hands. The fingertips were worn down to bone, scratched raw, as if he had clawed his way through frozen ground. Victor backed away, shaking his head. "No, this isn't a man." The stranger turned, his eyes burning red in the firelight, and then his jaw began to stretch. The cabin erupted in chaos. The figure lunged forward, unnaturally fast, knocking Daniel to the ground. Its jaw unhinged, wider, wider, a black pit ringed with shattered teeth. Edward fired his rifle. The shot slammed into the thing's shoulder, but instead of falling, it only shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, like the forest itself screaming. The fire roared as if fueled by the sound. The lanterns burst into shards of glass. Victor pulled his knife, slashing at the creature's throat. But no blood came, only steam rising into the air. Michael screamed, scrambling for the door. The creature turned toward him. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door swung open. The night air rushed in, and the thing vanished into the trees. The four men sat trembling, blood on the floor, glass scattered across the cabin. "Tell me you saw that," Daniel whispered. But none of them spoke, because to name what they had seen was to give it power, and already it had too much. The days blurred. The traps remained empty. The food stores dwindled. What little dried meat they had was nearly gone. Michael began to mutter under his breath. At first nonsense, then words. He complained of hunger constantly. He stared at the others too long. Edward caught him once, looking at Daniel as though he weren't a man, but a meal. When confronted, Michael burst into tears. "I can't stop thinking about it," he sobbed. "I can't stop." Victor whispered the word again. "Wendigo." Edward refused to hear it. "He's exhausted, that's all. He just needs rest." But Michael didn't rest. That night, Edward woke to the sound of chewing. In the corner by the fire's embers, Michael crouched, gnawing on something pale. When Edward stepped closer, his blood ran cold. It was the bone they had found beneath the cabin. The forest outside was silent. The smell of rot filled the room. And now, one of their own was changing. The Wendigo was no longer circling the cabin. It was already inside. Michael was on his knees by the fire, gnawing. The sound was wet, cracking. The sound of hunger that had forgotten what it meant to be human. Edward froze. Daniel whispered his name. Victor stood in the shadows, knife already in hand. Michael lifted his head. His mouth was slick with marrow. His eyes gleamed with something wild, something that no longer belonged to him. "I couldn't stop," he whispered. "It called me." "It's inside me now," Edward tried to reason. "You're just hungry." "That's all. We'll find food." Michael cut him off, voice breaking. "You don't understand. I can taste you. All of you." The fire popped. The wind moaned against the cabin walls, and then Michael lunged. He slammed into Daniel, teeth snapping, hands clawing for his throat. Edward grabbed his rifle. Victor grabbed Michael's arm. The cabin erupted in screams and splintering wood. Daniel's head smashed against the floorboards as he fought to push Michael off. "Don't kill him!" Edward shouted. "He's sick! He's not gone yet!" But Victor's eyes were cold. "He's gone." The knife flashed. Michael shrieked, thrashing as steel sank into his side. He twisted, jaw unhinging wider than before, biting down on Victor's shoulder. Victor roared in pain. He pulled the blade free and drove it again, deep. This time, Michael fell. For a moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the 3 survivors. Then came the smell. It rose thick from Michael's body, a stench so foul it burned their eyes. His skin darkened, stretched, splitting along his arms. Steam hissed from the wounds. And then he began to move again. Edward raised his rifle, trembling. "Don't!" Michael's eyes snapped open. They burned red, glowing in the dim firelight. His mouth widened, tearing flesh at the corners. His scream rattled the cabin walls. Edward fired. The shot tore through Michael's chest. He fell back, smoke curling from the wound. And then, silence. Edward lowered the rifle. His hands shook. His heart hammered. But before relief could take hold, Victor spoke in a hoarse whisper. "He's not the only one." Outside, the footsteps began again. Slow, heavy, circling. The 3 men pressed against the walls, rifles raised. Shadows slid between the trees. A shape loomed at the edge of the clearing, taller than the cabin, gaunt and monstrous, crowned with antlers like blackened branches. Its eyes glowed like coals, and then, from everywhere at once, came the voices. Not one voice. Dozens, hundreds, all whispering, calling, crying out in pain and hunger. It wasn't just one Wendigo. It was many. The door rattled. The windows shook. The cabin groaned as if the forest itself leaned down upon it. Daniel screamed at Edward. "We have to run!" Victor grabbed his arm. "No, if you leave the fire, you'll never come back." The walls shuddered. A claw, long and black, punched through the logs, inches from Edward's head. He fired point blank. The claw withdrew, leaving only steam and splinters. But more were coming. The cabin would not hold. Daniel panicked first. He bolted for the door, yanking it open into the night. "Daniel!" Edward shouted, but it was too late. The cold swallowed him. The voices rose in unison, and then the screaming began. It didn't last long. Only seconds. A wet, tearing sound. Bones snapping, and then silence. Daniel was gone. Edward collapsed against the wall, choking back sobs. Victor stared at the fire, his face pale, blood soaking his shoulder. "We won't survive this," Victor whispered. "Not both of us." Edward looked at him. "What are you saying?" Victor's eyes glistened in the firelight. "The Wendigo always leaves one alive. To tell the story, to spread the fear, that's how it survives." The footsteps thundered now. Shadows swarmed outside. Antlers scraped across the roof. The fire sputtered low, sparks dying one by one. Edward scrambled for more wood, but Victor stopped him. "Don't," he said. "The fire won't save us." Edward's breath came fast, panicked. "Then what will?" Victor lifted his knife. "Sacrifice." Before Edward could react, Victor plunged the blade into his own chest. Edward screamed, lunging forward, but Victor held him back with bloodied hands. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "Run," he whispered. "Tell them." And then his eyes dimmed. The fire guttered out. The cabin fell into darkness, and in that blackness, Edward heard the voices rise again. They weren't outside anymore. They were inside. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor creaked beneath unseen weight. The stench of rot suffocated him. And then, silence. Edward waited, frozen, heart slamming against his ribs. He couldn't see. He could barely breathe. And then a voice spoke, right beside his ear. Hungry. What happened next was never written down. Edward was found months later, wandering the forest alone. His cabin was a ruin, its walls torn down, the snow around it stained with blood. Of the others, there was nothing, no bodies, no bones, no sign they had ever been there at all. When questioned, Edward gave no clear answers. He spoke of voices, of shadows, of a hunger that could not die, and when asked what had happened that final night, he only whispered one word: Wendigo. By the time the thaw came, the high pines dripped like old chandeliers, and the forest finally remembered how to breathe. Searchers moved along the riverbeds with poles and ropes, not looking for men anymore, but for answers. They found neither. The cabin was a mouth torn open. Timbers caved inward, as if something had eaten its way out from the floor. The stove lay on its side, iron belly split. A single antler tine was fused to the warped metal like a branch caught in a lightning strike. No tracks remained. Snowmelt and wind had smoothed the clearing to a clean, white scar. Edward was found 30 miles south, boots gone, feet wrapped in shirt sleeves, face burned raw by wind. He had made a camp from boughs and bark and the brittle skeleton of a fallen spruce. When they reached him and spoke his name, he startled like a deer mid-drink. He refused food at first. When he finally ate, he chewed and swallowed with a grimace, as if every bite was a test. "What happened to the others?" they asked. He stared through them, jaws working, eyes glassy. "They're still here," he said. "You just can't see them when it's warm." He would not say more. Years later, when the story had been told enough times to grow its own bones, people began to debate. Some blamed starvation and fear, the hard winter's twin blades. Others said there was nothing supernatural at all. 4 men, too long in the woods, turned on one another. A murder, a cover-up, a survivor going mad. Simple as that. But the forest, if it could speak, might offer a different account. Because long before Edward's winter, others had walked out of these trees with the same look in their eyes. Priests wrote it in tidy letters. Trappers carved it into planks. The old nations told it by firelight. The story kept returning with the cold. So what exactly did Edward walk out of? If we lay the possibilities on the table, cold, clean, unsentimental, 3 paths appear. They do not exclude one another. In fact, they braid. On paper, this is the simplest road. Isolation deforms time. Hunger edits the mind. You spend long enough without sleep, and your brain will manufacture voices. Begin with your own, then borrow the ones you miss. The smell of rot, a dead animal nearby, snow-sheltered until a warm breath woke it. The prints in the snow, melt shrink and drift distortion, turn moose tracks into giant human feet. The man at the door? a half-frozen stranger at the edge of delirium, misread as a monster by men already primed to fear. Michael's collapse, his gnawing on the bone, that's where the rational path meets its sharpest edge. We can say hypothermia makes people act strange. We can say pica, the urge to eat what is not food, sometimes blooms in starvation. We can say that in the dark, with the wrong story playing in your head, you can turn a friend's convulsion into a convocation of demons. But then there is the knife, there is the gun, there is the body that should have bled and didn't. We could argue bad angles, poor light, adrenaline lies. We could say the shots missed fatal lines and steam rose because breath was still moving, hot against cold air. We could say that Daniel's run into the night ended in a ravine and spring swallowed what winter preserved. We can say Victor's wound was the only deliberate death, a tragedy misremembered as sacrifice. If we stop there, the story becomes a case report. Exposure, psychosis, homicide, misadventure. The file shuts. The forest returns to green. The door closes, but it doesn't feel closed, does it? That's the trouble with rational doors in irrational places. They shut clean, but never lock. There is another road through these trees. People have walked it for centuries with torches and prayers. On this path, the Wendigo is not a metaphor but a presence, older than the languages that named it, clever enough to borrow a voice. On this path, what appeared at the door was not a starving man but a shape that wears the memory of one. It knocked because it wanted to be invited inside. It pleaded because pity opens more doors than force. Its fingers were bone because it had scratched through earth to reach a place it remembered. On this path, the thing under the floor was not a leftover grave, but a burrow. Not bones from a crime, but the latch to a mouth. The knocking beneath Edward's bed wasn't taunt or coincidence. It was ritual. A warning to awake the hunger in the cabin before the hunger in the trees arrived. Here, the voices are not tricks of acoustics, but the forest speaking with everything it has taken into itself. Victor's quiet naming is not superstition, but diagnosis, a rulebook handed down the only way rules survive winters, by becoming stories. On this path, the antlers that scraped the roof belong to something that grows by eating and never, ever stops. Every time it feeds, it stretches. Every time it stretches, the world around it must make room. On this path, the way the stove warped and fused to horn becomes an artifact, not an accident. The absence of bodies becomes a sign, not an oversight. The survivor becomes a requirement. Because in the old stories, the Wendigo often leaves one witness. The curse does not just want flesh, it wants belief. Hunger spreads quickest when it travels as a story. You can dismiss this path. It won't argue with you, it will simply keep walking, 1 foot in folklore, 1 foot in the snow, until it is behind you. There is a third way, and it binds the other two. The Wendigo can be both a presence and a pattern, both a thing in the woods, and the shape our fear takes when we are cornered by winter, debt, greed, ambition, anything we hunger for past what our bodies and souls can hold. Call it a cultural sickness if you want. Call it mass suggestion, narrative infection. Call it the moment when a story climbs out of your mouth and begins to live in your hands. Think about what the Wendigo punishes: taking more than you need, consuming your own to survive yourself, devouring not for life, but for appetite. No matter how modern we make the world, that temptation remains. It isn't just about food, it's attention, money, land, followers. The market never sleeps. The feed never empties. The algorithm wants one thing: more. If the old people needed a shape for that devouring urge, they chose well. The monster looks like us stretched past ourselves. Under this light, what happened in the cabin becomes the oldest parable wearing a new winter coat. Fear starved them. Suspicion seasoned them. The story salted the edges, and then hunger sat down at their table, asked for a seat, and everyone complied. Michael's eyes in the firelight, Victor's knife, Daniel's sprint into the night, Edward's emptiness when he finally walked out. Every step mapped to a lesson the old ones already taught. When the cold comes, share. When the silence deepens, speak. When the voice calls your name from the trees, do not answer back. You can live a whole life without snow and still meet the Wendigo. You meet it when you justify a little harm for a little gain. When your hunger tells you that what you want is worth more than who you love. When a voice inside shapes itself like permission and whispers, "Just this once." Stories are medicine, but like medicine, they change you. There were other details, small, stubborn things that refused to lie down. Edward, months later, developed a quiet superstition. He never sat with his back to a door. He carried a pouch of tobacco in his pocket, not because he smoked, but because he said the forest listens better when you pay it first. He tried to return once, in summer. They say he stood at the edge of the clearing where the cabin had been and did not step in. He tossed tobacco into the grass. He spoke words none of the searchers understood. He waited a long time and left the clearing before the sun reached noon. In town, he kept to himself. When questions came, he gave spare answers. But sometimes, late, if the bar was nearly empty and the hockey game had faded into the drone of the air conditioner, he'd lean in and offer a single warning. "It isn't teeth you should fear," he'd say. "It's appetite." He died in his sleep 10 winters later. On the night he passed, a storm rose without warning. Wind bent the black spruces to boughs. In the morning, the line to the north was down and the road out to the logging cut looked as if something had stepped across it, carving prints the plows could not flatten. The people who loved him said the storm was nothing. An Arctic front moving quick. The people who listened still to old warnings poured a little coffee on the earth and turned their mugs clockwise 3 times before they drank. If you ask me where I land among the 3 paths, rational, paranormal, psychological, I will tell you the truth. The forest does not care which door you choose. It answers you in whatever language you bring to it. Bring science, it offers you pressure ridges, sound inversion layers, the neurology of starvation. Bring ceremony, it offers you a shape at the edge of the clearing and a voice that borrows the sound of your mother's throat. Bring a mirror, it offers you yourself, just taller, hungrier, and too quick to say yes. What did Edward see? I believe he saw all 3. Winter took his body, story took his mind, and something older than both took the space between, wearing antlers and frost, and a mouth that remembers every name it's ever called. Still, even belief should be humble. There are things in this world that deserve silence. Some names you do not shout across frozen lakes. Some creatures you do not summon with your cleverness. The Wendigo belongs to people who kept that story alive so their children would live. Remember that when you repeat it. Stories have owners. The forest has rules. The old rule is simple. Do not take more than you need, not meat. not time, not attention, because the cost is always appetite. You pay it in pieces of yourself. The bill comes due in winter. If the tale lingers tonight when you turn out your light, do one thing for me. Listen, not for voices, not for footsteps. Listen for your own hunger. Ask it who it serves. If it answers honestly, you will sleep. If it does not, keep the candle lit. Because sometimes the dark isn't empty. Sometimes it's full of echoes waiting to hear if you'll speak first. There's one last scrap I've held back. A detail from an old, thin notebook that turned up in an estate sale in Thunder Bay. It wasn't police, not priest, just neat block letters from a surveyor in the 1930s, sent to map timber boundaries before the mills moved north. On a page near the back he wrote, "Caught a stink on the wind this morning, like meat and pennies." Followed it to a clearing where someone had put logs down for a floor and never built the walls. Found a tin cup, a spoon, and what I thought was a root. When I kicked it, it rang. Antler. I put it in my pack and carried it half a mile before it got hot and I threw it away. He didn't say where exactly. He didn't need to. The forest keeps its own coordinates. If you're meant to find a place, the silence will show you. People go missing out there. Most return, cold and embarrassed, full of stories about maps and dead batteries. Some do not. The statistics can be kind if you stay near marked trails. But the thing about marked trails is that somebody has to lay them down first. Somebody has to step into a clearing and decide it isn't safe. Somebody has to hear knocking under the floor and admit the ground has a mouth. If the Wendigo were only a story, it would have starved centuries ago. But hunger thrives in every age. It changes shape. It learns new words. It mimics our voices so well, we cannot tell where the call is coming from, outside the window, or from under our own ribs. So let this be the talisman you carry, the one rule you bring back from the fire. When the winter inside you says to take, to consume, to make a meal of what you love, answer it with a full sentence. No. And then find someone else a warm place by your fire and give them the first bowl. That is how you starve a legend. That is how you survive a forest that remembers everything. And if you want more stories like this, if you believe these dark myths, strange histories and forgotten legends are worth remembering, help us keep the archive alive. Like this video, subscribe, share the warmth. Your support keeps the candle lit and lets us step a little farther into the dark next time. As for Edward's clearing, people say if you stand there at dusk in late February, the pines lean in and the air gets heavier. You will smell something metallic and sweet, and you will hear a voice you know whisper your name from everywhere at once. They say the trick is not to answer, not even once. Because if this was only a story, why do so many still vanish here?